Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and we are celebrating March by paying tribute to one of my favorite filmmakers of all time. He is the larger than life presence, the master of the big screen historical epic, Cecil B. DeMille. And we are kicking off this series with a very underrated film from 1935. It is The Crusades, starring the gorgeous Loretta Young, Ian Keith, and as Richard the Lionheart, Henry Wilcoxon. Tonight's guest, he is a film historian and author of the book Cecil B. DeMille, The Art of the Hollywood Epic. It's certainly a must-have if you love either Cecil B. DeMille's work or vintage Hollywood. Please welcome Mr. Mark A. Vieira. How are you doing tonight, Mark?
Fine, thank you.
So, The Crusades, as I said, it was released in 1935. Where was Cecil B. DeMille at this point in his career?
He was riding high. Cleopatra had been a big hit the previous summer, and before that, The Sign of the Cross had been a major, major hit that had reinstated him as an important producer at Paramount after a few years of problems with MGM, where he just didn't quite fit in. And before that, with running his own studio, where he just decided he didn't really like the business of running a studio in addition to making films. So when it came time for the Crusades, they said, okay, well, epics are doing well, historical films are doing well, especially in 1935 Hollywood with House of Rothschild had been a hit, Treasure Island had been a hit, Mutiny on the Bounty was in production, so it really was everything was being green lighted that was about another era. And, Daryl Zanuck in the same spring of 35 had merged or was merging with the failing Fox Film Corporation, which had a great studio facility, huge backlot, and a separate production facility at Sunset and Western. So Zanuck's idea was take his various properties that were derived from public domain historical fiction and make these big projects like House of Rothschild and Lloyd's of London. And that formula worked for him. So all Hollywood was, paying attention. Would this guy who left Warner Brothers, with bad feelings, would he be a success? And sure enough, he was. And in the first year after pre-code had ended, when the production code was in full force, these historical films lent themselves very well to family entertainment. So that was the formula. So that's why DeMille said, okay, Cleopatra did well, let's do another one like that. And he was fascinated by the story of the various Crusades. They telescoped these decades and centuries of Crusades into one narrative line that they could put the same characters in, and namely Richard the Lionheart and Berengaria. And Cecil B. DeMille's daughter was also in the film. So it was an auspicious project. It looked very good on paper, and of course on paper, well, specifically on artboard, was where DeMille's films were planned and really worked out using production art, these beautiful paintings by Dan Sayer Grosbeck, showing shot for shot what the film would look like, even down to the lighting effects. And then DeMille had to go into the hospital, but even there he was able to review costume sketches and helmets that were being made for the film and everything. Ralph Jester, one of the designers, brought the stuff to him, as you'll see in the picture. It looked like everything was going great, and since Cleopatra had been a success, DeMille assumed that the leading man whom he had introduced in that film, the British actor who was in his early 30s, Henry Wilcoxon, he assumed that he would be a big draw for audiences in the Crusades. And then he cast Loretta Young, who was just finishing filming The Call of the Wild, another period film. That was for Daryl Zanuck, and she was under contract to Daryl Zanuck at that time. What DeMille did not know was that Loretta Young was pregnant with Clark Gable's baby because they had been on location together and gotten very cozy. And I want to make it very clear that I wrote to Loretta Young's daughter-in-law, Linda Lewis, and said, I respect that Loretta Young felt that she had to, in some way, balance the stories, balance the scales of what her daughter wrote about, the, why she was born out of wedlock and then raised as an adopted child. But Clark Gable did not rape Loretta Young, and there was all kinds of historically available and in published in print since the 70s about this, saying,
Mhm.
the director, the production assistants, people, everybody who worked on the film in, I guess it was Washington State where they filmed it on location,
Mhm.
said that there was this affair going on, that she was basically living with Clark Gable on location. So that when she came back to Los Angeles, the next project she was going to do was the Crusades.
Mhm.
And DeMille realized he better shoot her scenes first
Mhm.
before she became too visibly pregnant.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll definitely keep an eye out that for that in the film. I had no idea about that. So how did the rape rumor get started?
When she was in the last years of her life, she really felt badly as a devout Catholic,
Mhm.
felt badly that she would be thought of as a loose woman, a sinner, if this if her daughter's story assumed the currency that, let's say, Christina Crawford's book about Joan Crawford did.
Right. Yeah.
So Loretta Young felt that she had to counteract that by saying, "Well, I didn't. It wasn't my idea. I was raped."
Hmm.
That it just everybody who was there said, "Boy, they were totally in love."
Yeah. Which I can imagine. I mean, it's Loretta Young and Clark Gable, all right? I'm sure there's some chemistry there. This film, I believe, should be approached like most of DeMille's work films as a work of romantic historical fiction. That's why I love it. But when you look at it in 1930, in the 1930s, it wasn't the safest decade, shall we say, for let's say cultural sensitivity. But the film does have some nuance in its portrayal of the Saracens and the portrayal, especially of Saladin, played by Ian Keith, who I think is very noble and a very, very courageous figure in this film.
A very intelligent and thoughtful figure too. The people who saw it in Egypt liked
Hmm.
it, and later, when DeMille came there to film the Ten Commandments in 1954, there was some problem about whether his permissions he'd gotten to film there would be valid when he got there.
Hmm.
And the military men said, "Oh, we liked your film, The Crusades, very much. You may film here without any problem
Yeah.
because you treated those characters of our race, so fairly,
Yes.
namely
And I think
Saladin."
oh yeah, no, especially the character of Saladin. Before we get started, for anyone in the audience who maybe has never seen a Cecil B. DeMille movie, maybe they've never seen the Ten Commandments somehow, what do they have to look forward to the Crusades?
They should look for boldness of design, uh, immensity of scale, uh, sensitivity of coloring and nuance, basically in characters, um, and a strong narrative arc. You will have suspense. But DeMille's, when his granddaughter asked him one time when she was a little girl, "Grandpa, what do you do?" He said, "I tell stories." And for him, that was the most important thing, to tell a story that people would not uh, get bored with as they're watching it in the movie theater,
Hmm.
because those seats could be hard in those days. Although
Yeah.
there's those picture palaces, I wouldn't think so. But the point is, he knew that an audience has an attention span, and you can't presume to you can't take it for granted. You have to keep them interested at every point. Something bold and visual and the sounds and music, all those elements that he used so skillfully.
Skillful is certainly the right term. So if you're in the audience, please stick around after the film and you can hear the rest of our conversation. without further ado, from 1935, director Cecil B. DeMille's The Crusades. This movie, it's powerful, it's moving, and I think it still holds up, both as a romance and as just a wonderfully made action film.
Well, also it's you've got such wonderful people in it.
Yes, yeah.
From his daughter Catherine DeMille and Ian Keith and Loretta Young. They're all just really and Alan Hale too, as you recall, who was so wonderful in It Happened One Night, Adventure
Yes.
of Robin Hood, all the films he did with Errol Flynn.
You know what?
Uh,
I'm glad you mentioned that real quick. So I mean, the film was made in 35. Adventures of Robin Hood came out in 1938. But I think because of the era and Alan Hale acting in both films, I always felt like The Crusades made a really great companion piece or a good double feature with the Adventures of Robin Hood.
I agree. Yeah, they're both bigger than life characters. The other thing I should mention, being a photographer myself and having
Hmm.
studied the cinematography and still photography of these films so thoroughly, is that this film was photographed by Victor Milner,
Hmm.
who had, well, let's see, this is March, shooting in March, April. Yeah, well, I think while they were filming this movie, he received the Academy Award for the Best Cinematography of 1934, which was for Cecil B. DeMille's Cleopatra.
Hmm.
And this film, The Crusades, has some beautiful lighting effects, uh, beautiful set pieces. And one particular one I should mention that you just seen the film is when Loretta Young is praying and the troops are mobilizing, and you see their shadows on the fabric of the tent behind her.
Hmm.
So effects like that. But those things would have been worked out between Dan Sayer Grosbeck and Victor Milner with DeMille's approval.
Hmm. No, Cecil B. DeMille, he's a name that today we remember him best as the director of the Ten Commandments, which, of course, is shown on television every year. It gets revived into theaters quite often. It's a personal favorite film of mine. But I always felt like, as an artist, for whatever reason, he doesn't get enough credit as a filmmaker, as a visionary. As you said, DeMille, even working within Paramount, he had his own production company, his own production team. He had a hand in every aspect of production, from development. He had script approval, the visual design. So this, I mean, he certainly was the auteur of all of his own films. Why do you think in this day and age, to me, he doesn't get the respect that, say, a John Ford or an Alfred Hitchcock do? Why is that?
There was a campaign for a long time against him because people perceived him as being conservative, and the facts were he did not militate against people at that meeting in 1950 that was supposed to be such a terrible thing. Mankiewicz pretty much made that up, Joseph Mankiewicz. And he hired Edward G. Robinson, who had been blacklisted by the House Un American Activities Committee, that whole witch hunt. He hired Edward G. Robinson for the Ten Commandments.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Robinson wrote in his autobiography, uh, Cecil B. DeMille saved my career and brought me back from the dead.
Hmm.
Um, and the other thing, too, is the films made by Paramount between 1929, 30, and 48 belonged to Universal. Universal bought them. It was Lou Wasserman and his partner, Jules Stein, MCA, Music Corporation of America, who took over Universal. They bought the Paramount Library, and so it went on to TV in 1958. But DeMille's films went on in 62 because the family was negotiating with Wasserman for a better
Hmm.
deal. Okay, the point is of all this, of all the Hollywood films, these are the least seen, I would say, for the last 30 years, because Universal just kind of lost interest in home video. And uh, whereas the MGM films, the Warner Brothers films, you could see them on cable in VHS and then DVDs. These films just took forever for Universal to put out there, and ultimately boutique DVD companies like Kino Lorber sublicensed from Universal. the Paramount pre 48 movies. So they
Hmm.
are being seen now, but that's what happened is that you just couldn't see them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not as bad as the Fox film where you could never see them,
Right.
but at least because people of my age grew up with the movies on TV in the '60s, and boy,
Hmm.
you would see these all the time. But that and then they were on American Movie Classics in the '80s, and they were on video for a while. But then it just kind of dried up, and because Universal, going through all its corporate changes, just lost interest.
Hmm. Which is unfortunate, but I'm glad that, like you said, Kino Lorber, companies like Arrow, Criterion, I feel like it's a golden age for the physical media collector because you're getting a lot of great stuff. Some of it's never even been released on VHS, and we're getting these beautiful remastered versions that I think it's a great opportunity for film lovers.
Yeah, unfortunately, the rights are clear on a lot of the films.
Hmm.
So you can see beautifully restored version of the Crusades, Cleopatra, Sign of the Cross.
Yeah. Well, going back to the Crusades, what was the reception like at that time?
There was a big problem.
Hmm.
Um, they were counting on it being a British topic, a British theme. So they were
Hmm.
really going to use a premiere in England as the touchstone for the entire campaign. Well,
Hmm.
what happens is the King of England died, and there was a formal period of mourning and the state funeral and everything, and this film just could not open. Uh, and that pretty much is extended to Europe, that problem. So when they opened it in the United States, there was no momentum to carry it. And also the reviewers are kind of nasty to it. Whether that affected people all over the country for the first release, the first week, I should say, that's a question. I think it would in New York, definitely.
Hmm.
But Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, the big theater where the big houses were, the big theatrical houses,
Hmm.
um, they would go, and then word of mouth would by the second or third day would be, well, how's this going to do? Well, it didn't do well for whatever reason, um, and it may just have been that the subject was too hard for people to grasp, or they didn't have the patience, or just they just were overwhelmed by so many films being released, historical films being released at that time. But it really it just didn't do well. And then when it went to movies in those days would play for a week in the big theaters. Then was the second week in the neighborhood theaters. Then the more smaller theaters would go about a month, and then would go. The prints would be shipped to regional theaters. Well, it really did badly there. They just people in those little towns, lumber and mining towns, just had no interest in the Crusades. And
Hmm.
Loretta Young wasn't a big enough star to pull them in, um, and Wilcoxon just wasn't enough. What his success in Cleopatra wasn't sufficient.
Hmm.
So it was a sad thing that this film just didn't get a fair shake. Now it did go into reissue later, and it made back its money. It balanced the books with
Hmm.
a reissue. But sad to say, the initial thing just was a blow. But then the next film that DeMille did was The Plainsman with Gary Cooper and Jean
Hmm.
Arthur, and they had tremendous star power. And the film, another inaccurate historical situation, but
Sure.
his the dramatic tapestry was enough to beguile people, and really that was a super hit.
Well, that's good. Did it give the Paramount bosses like Adolf Zukor, did the failure of the Crusades kind of give them, were they second guessing their relationship with DeMille at that point?
Not so much as they had before.
Hmm.
Uh, in 1923, when he had spent so much on Ten Commandments, and that was a major rift. But
Yeah.
this time they cut him some slack because he had had two big hits just
Hmm.
before, and they understood what happened in England too.
Okay, well, that's good. Now, I understand you had a bit of a friendship with the star of the film, Henry Wilcoxon.
Yeah, in September 1975, I was referred to him by a lady named Dorothy Denny of a magazine called Hollywood Studio Magazine. And I had just photographed Anna Lee, the actress who you probably remember from General Hospital, as well
Mhm.
as from all the John Ford films. And so I had, examples of my work to show, portrait work. So I went over to his home in Burbank on a very hot uh, weekday afternoon and did portraits of him smoking a pipe. But he told me, he referred to DeMille as the old man.
Mhm.
What else he told? Oh, he said, let me light my pipe here and you catch the smoke. He says, because smoke never gives a bad performance. But he was really something. I mean, talk about bigger than life. And he was in
Mhm.
his, I guess, early 70s. He was born in 1905. So yeah, he'd be like, 70, 71,
Mhm.
roughly 71. Um, and he just was as nice as could be. And he said, I'm a little hard of hearing because I was on the bridge of a destroyer in World War II.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, he was really something. Just a gracious person from another era, another style of deportment. But it was
Oh,
really a pleasure. And then he referred me to Catherine DeMille, and I did her portrait a few months later.
oh, wow. So you met two of the stars of the film.
Yeah, and two whose work I have really followed too,
Of
because I was
course,
able to
yeah.
talk to her about The Black Room and Viva Villa and Belle of the '90s, and she said, "Oh yeah, Mae West. Oh, she was something to work with." She
Yeah.
thought that I was better, had a better figure than she did, so she told Travis Banton to pad my 1890s hourglass costumes. And when we'd come on the set in the morning, she'd walk by me and poke her finger into my waistline to see if the padding was there.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
The level of pettiness. But yeah, so for the people in the audience who may not know, Catherine DeMille was also the first wife of Anthony Quinn.
that's right. Yeah, yeah.
But no, I think she's wonderful in this film, and so is Henry Wilcoxon. Now, Henry Wilcoxon, he was actually handpicked by DeMille to star as Mark Antony in Cleopatra, and I think he's a wonderful masculine presence. He's very likable. I mean, he's very gruff but likable in both of these films. Why did he not have a bigger career than he did?
No one knows that, but part of it was I don't think Cleopatra made him a star
Hmm.
any more than this thing destroyed his career. But I think he could have done better. But DeMille, just this terrible misunderstanding happened with DeMille, which
Hmm.
was he had a contractual renegotiation with Paramount, and his agent had him really worried about this. And
Hmm.
DeMille called him and says, "Oh, I need to see you to do something, uh, some tests and things." And he said, "Well, I can't until I hear from them, from Paramount, and from my agent." And DeMille was furious because DeMille really was one of the founders of Paramount and of the Hollywood studio system.
Hmm.
And this guy was, in essence, questioning his authority. So
Yeah.
DeMille got furious with him, wouldn't talk to him, and basically blackballed him for 10 years.
Hmm. Oh wow.
It was only after he came back from World War II, kind of a hero, Wilcoxon, that DeMille said, "Well, would you like to come and help me produce, be an assistant producer or
Hmm.
associate producer?"
Well, I like seeing him even as an associate producer. He still managed to find good supporting roles for him in these other DeMille films. Like I always think of Samson and Delilah. He's one of the heavies, and then in the Ten Commandments, he plays Ramsey's right hand man in that. And I think he's
Right.
very memorable in all.
He had just done. He had played a Native American in A Man Called Horace with Richard Harris.
Hmm.
So he was working right up till the end. He was in also Caddyshack 5 years later.
Yeah, he's the bishop in Caddyshack. I remember
Yeah,
that.
and he was in Mrs. Miniver too, playing a priest.
That's right. I mean, he had a few good kind of memorable screen roles throughout his career, but he never reached the heights as a leading man that he
It's
had
that's such
in.
a there's
Yeah.
nobody ever understood you know how that works, why it works, but
Mhm.
they used fan mail to gauge it.
And speaking of the DeMille stock company, one actor who I always really enjoy, who he's usually Probably one of the most famous villains for Cecil B. DeMille is Joseph Schildkraut, who in this film he is Conrad of Montferrat, and of course I first knew him as Judas in The King of Kings.
Right, and his father was in that too, Rudolph. I wish I could have met him and photographed him, but he
Mhm.
was gone by the time I was started to do my portraits in the early 70s.
So, Mark, do you have any closing thoughts on the Crusades?
It's just something that I think people can see, thanks to Kino Lorber and Universal's cooperation, can see
Mhm.
in a beautiful restoration, and it deserves to be seen and enjoyed. And Ian Keith is great. That's somebody else who could have been bigger and wasn't, but at least we have his performance in Nightmare Alley, and in Queen
Yeah.
Christina he's very good too.
And is this true? I've always heard the rumor that Ian Keith was Universal's first choice to play Dracula. Is there any foundation to
Uh,
that?
yeah, there were several, but yeah, I mean, they really wanted Lon Chaney, but then they were
Of
looking
course.
at Ian Keith. You're right.
Yeah. Which I mean he had that very kind of dark look, that heavy brow. I think he would have made it interesting. So as I mentioned earlier, you wrote this wonderful book, Cecil B. DeMille, The Art of the Hollywood Epic. Is there anything else you're working on right now? Any recent books you want us to know about?
My book, George Horrell's Hollywood, I would just recommend it to anyone who's interested in the history of movies, in photography, in the art world, in art scandals, and just in the process of star making. You've got all these great people: Loretta Young, Joan Crawford, Clark Gable, Gary Cooper, Norma Shearer, who really gave Horrell his big start in the building where I have my studio. So
Oh
yeah, I
wow.
recommend that. It's fun, and you will never see more beautiful reproductions of classic Hollywood pictures, because the lithography that this company did, it's running press, but the actual printer is 1010 limited, which has their plant in China. They did a
Mhm.
beautiful job, so I'm very proud of that book.
All right. Well, I'm certainly looking forward to checking it out for myself. Mr. Mark A. Vieira, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Yes, it was certainly a pleasure for me too, and it was a pleasure getting to watch the Crusades once more. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.